Um, okay, well, I want to welcome you to the Illinois State Library. At least this was the Illinois State Library when Abraham Lincoln first walked into this room in 1842. And you have to remember that when this library first opened in late 1842, they had literally over 60,000 volumes in this one room. Now, obviously, we don't have that many in here right now, but again, most of those books are over in the Illinois State Historical Library or the archives for preservation reasons. But there would have been all kinds of books in here, and remember that when this library opened in 1842, it would have been certainly the best library in the state of Illinois, and certainly in Springfield, but probably it would have been the best library in this part of the country. And we know certainly it was the best library that Lincoln had ever had easy access to, and probably the best library he had ever seen. And remember that when this library opened in 1842, Lincoln had his law offices right across the street where the Lincoln Herndon law offices are today. So we know Abraham Lincoln must have been very excited when he walked into this library for the first time, because I know you've all heard those stories about how much Lincoln loved to read, how he'd walk miles and miles to borrow a book from a friend or return a book to a friend. Well, now he can walk right across the street and have easy access to the best library he's probably ever seen. So we know Lincoln was excited when this library opened, because I'll give you only one guess. Who do you think the first person to check a book out of this library was? Abraham Lincoln. And yes, Abraham Lincoln was the first person to check a book out of this library, although he actually did, since we have professional historians here, I'll tell you, he did check it out under the name of Stephen Logan, who was his law partner at the time. Because Logan, as a member of the state legislature, had privileges to check books out of here, whereas Abraham Lincoln was no longer, by 1842, a member of the state legislature. He already completed his last term, so he didn't really have borrowing privileges. So Lincoln, forged is too strong a word. He used his law partners
identity theft.
as he, well, you know, it was okay for him to do that because they were law partners at the time. He used Stephen Logan's name and he signed it, but it's very clearly Abraham Lincoln's handwriting if you look at the ledger book. So Abraham Lincoln checked the book out of here. The first person to do so was actually a book on the state laws of New York in 1842 when the library first opened. Later on, all the law books were consolidated across the hall in the law library. But we know Lincoln used this library frequently. We have historical records that prove that he checked out novels. He checked out Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein for his son Robert. Lots of books, different kinds of books. And we know that Abraham Lincoln researched two of his greatest speeches prior to being elected president right here in this library. He wrote and researched his House Divided speech right here in this room that he delivered upstairs in June of 1858. To kick off his U.S. Senate campaign versus the little giant Stephen A. Douglas. And then 2 years later, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln wrote and researched his Cooper Union address that he delivered on February 27, 1860, at the Cooper Union Institute in New York City to kick off his presidential campaign. So Abraham Lincoln wrote and researched both of those great speeches right here in this room. And as a matter of fact, many historians believe that this room, this library, and the books in this room, more than any other single place, provided the intellectual fuel for Abraham Lincoln from what he was when he first walked into this room in 1842, just a small-town lawyer from Springfield, Illinois, to what he became by the 1860s. Hi, folks. How are you? Welcome. What he became by the 1860s. Which is the kind of lawyer who could write something like the Gettysburg Address. Okay? So, as a matter of fact, we know a funny story about Abraham Lincoln and his address at the House Divided speech. Abraham Lincoln actually wrote his House Divided speech right here in this room, and he decided to give a practice delivery before all of his friends and political allies before he gave the main delivery upstairs. So we gathered all of his friends and political allies here in this room. The funny story about that speech is that after giving his practice delivery of the great House Divided speech here in this room to all of his friends, with only one exception, they all turned to Lincoln and they said, "Lincoln, please please, whatever you do, do not deliver that House divided speech. It'll be political suicide because you're talking about slavery, the controversial issue of the day, far too directly. You won't get elected to anything if you give that House divided speech. Well, Lincoln decided to go ahead and give that speech anyway. He decided to listen to his one and only friend president who liked that speech, and that was his law partner, William Herndon, because when Herndon heard that speech, he sort of scratched those whiskers of his and he said, you know, Lincoln, if you deliver that House divided speech, you're probably going to get yourself elected President of the United States. And sure enough, 2 years later in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and that process started right here in this library. So we're going to head right down the hall.